The Rebel Capitalist Show.
Jeff, let me ask you a question, and then Lynn, I'd like to get your thoughts on this on Jeff's answer. So is it possible to fix the U.S. economy without fixing the Eurodollar system?
No, I think it's not. I think the only way we're going to be able to fix the economy, especially in the long run, we can get it working a little bit here and there, as we saw in 2017 or 2014 or 2010. It seems to progress a little bit, and then it sputters again, and it's even worse in the rest of the global economy. So if we're talking about a long run solution, I think we need to replace the system. We need to replace the Eurodollar system. I would prefer to see one that isn't entirely bank centered, because obviously we've seen the downside of what happens when it sputters and when it doesn't work right. We need to find a system that works on all levels and does so predictably in a long-term fashion.
Okay, Lynn, what do you think?
I agree with that. I think if you get a partial kind of dollar devaluation, you can have one of those like 2017 periods where you get kind of a relief from it temporarily. I think the system as currently structured is at the point where it's not really good for the U.S. or the rest of the world anymore. And I think that goes all the way back to the Triffin's dilemma. Essentially, you basically had multiple decades where the dollar is the global reserve currency. At the same time, the U.S. After World War II, the United States was almost 40% of global GDP, because it was kind of the last man standing after that. Everything that happened. Then you had kind of the rebuilding of Japan. You had the rebuilding of Europe. You had the rise of emerging markets, especially China. And so now the U.S. is a much smaller percentage of global GDP. It's like 20 some percent now. It's like roughly 20%, and even lower if you look at purchasing power parity. It's in the teens based on that metric, and it's no longer the biggest commodity importer in the world. That's China now, and so we're trying to run this system for decades now, even though, and it's all running on one country's currency. And then it's all this big unregulated kind of Eurodollar. It's just it's a really kind of a messy situation now. And basically, if you get kind of that constraint in the amount of dollars kind of floating around and all that leverage built on it, you get these big kind of dollar denominated debts, denominated, in it's dollars. So those countries can't print dollars. They can't kind of offset. They can't devalue their debts. And so the system's kind of, I think at its limit. And in the U.S., we don't have the problem of the debt denominated in a currency we can't print. But essentially, what we have done is, because there's all this persistent demand for the dollars, we run kind of persistent trade deficits. Now that's mostly impacted the goods. So we have a mild services surplus, but we have decades and decades and decades of persistent goods deficits. And so the overall thing we've seen is we've kind of seen out of a hollowing out of our manufacturing base. And we've seen kind of a transition to a very services oriented economy, which is partially that's part of why we have so much wealth concentration. A lot of it's kind of monetary policy, but the other half of it, because we do have more wealth concentration than most of the rest of the developed world, and that's because in part because we have this big kind of center around technology and banking and government, and we've kind of hollowed out a lot of that blue collar work. The skilled kind of craftsmen, unskilled work. All that kind of blue collar stuff, we've really kind of exported a lot of it, and it's partially based on how we structured the system. And decades ago, we had a lot of benefits from it. Is described as an exorbitant privilege, and I think I've seen Jeff before describe it as an exorbitant burden now, and I would agree with that. That it really, at this point, it weighs almost everyone down the way it's currently structured, including the U.S. It's just it's a very kind of messy system that doesn't really benefit even us anymore, let alone others.
Yeah, and that's a really good point, Lynn, because it's one I try to make all the time, because one of the arguments against, doing something about the Eurodollar system is, the U.S. will give up this exorbitant privilege that it has with the dollar denominating, everything is denominated in U.S. dollars. And the point I make, all the time that you brought up is that, look, it doesn't even work for Americans, but we don't realize it because we're inside the U.S. We're inside essentially a dollar bubble. We don't see the direct impact between a currency system that doesn't work and the effects of that. Whereas the rest of the world, they can see that because their currencies move in direct proportion to, you made the point, Lynn, about, countries should be devaluing their currencies as a way to get around this. Well, they're devaluing their currencies, but they're being devalued involuntarily. And the result of that isn't a way out of their mess. It actually makes the mess even worse. So people can realize outside the U.S., they can see the direct relationship between a currency system that doesn't work and the economic consequences of it. So we have a bigger task in front of us to talk to Americans and say, look, you have to realize that the US dollar system as it's currently constituted doesn't work for you either. So even if we give up the US dollar as a reserve and go to something else, whatever that might be, it's not necessarily a bad thing. It's not like we're giving up something that's really valuable. It's we're getting rid of something that's trash and hopefully going to something that benefits everybody. And there is a way forward to do that. It's just, I think, first of all, there has to be a political understanding that that's the case. The case right now is the global dollar system as it actually exists right now doesn't work for anybody.
Jeff, you were saying that we can't really fix the system as is right now and have a permanent solution because it's predicated upon the banking system, and that is inherently volatile, let's say. So we'd need preferably, we'd have a system outside of the banking system. So my first question would be, what does that look like? And then I'd like to get both of your feedback on if we can transition to a better system smoothly. Is there a way to do that? Or are we just, the only way to transition is if the whole thing collapses and we rebuild it like the phoenix coming out of the ashes?
I hope not. I hope that's not the transition, but it's a difficult thing. And it starts with, recognizing the problem as it is and recognizing that there is a problem. And if we wait for politicians to get their heads out of their asses and say, okay, we need to do something, then maybe that's what we're left with doing. That the crisis, the next big crisis is what finally convinces them they need to do something. So,
and that's probably your animosity towards the Fed, right? I mean, you're always very emotional when you talk about the Fed with Emil and whatnot, but that's probably the crux of it, isn't it? Because you see the problem, it's so obvious to you, but they're ignoring the problem, just making it worse.
It's worse. I mean, this grand strategy review has really got me going because they're doing everything they can to avoid. All the evidence is pointing back at them. And so they're doing everything they can to avoid the truth, which is monetary policy doesn't work. The banking system is malfunctioning. We need to do something about it. And so they flatten the Phillips curve. They come up with this R-star nonsense, all this other crap, just so they can avoid what all the evidence is showing them. And so, back to your other question, where do we go from here? I think we transition to a world, hopefully, that is based in some way on digital currency, blockchain, whatever it might be. I don't necessarily believe that might be Bitcoin, but I think there's value in the Bitcoin technology. There's definitely value in blockchain technology, maybe an iteration or two down the road. There is definitely a way to do a currency system that is non-bank centered. And if you really think about it, blockchain, if you use blockchain as a payments base, to account for all the payments that flow throughout the economy, we don't even need banks anymore. We could have a bankless monetary system that would actually, I believe, function, assuming that we could set it up in the right manner. And right manner is a loaded term that opens all sorts of Pandora's boxes. But I think there's a way to do this, a digital currency way, so that it can be dependable, predictable, and operate in a steady fashion, a sustainably steady fashion that solves a lot of the basic issues with the Eurodollar system. I don't think it'll necessarily be perfect, but we can't let perfect be the enemy of good here.
Right. Wow, that's a bombshell right there, Jeff. I've never heard you talk about a currency or like a digital or cryptocurrency like that. Very cool. Lynn, what do you think about that?
I think so. I think the solution could take multiple forms, and I think it depends partially how far you look out, and then how optimistic you are about policymakers around the world kind of agreeing on a shared system, or just kind of breaking apart. Because I think one thing we're seeing now is we're seeing sort of a slight transition towards multipolar, oil pricing and commodity pricing. And I think it's one of those things where a currency inherently has a big network effect, especially, the global reserve currency. So the more dollars we used, the more we build up kind of offshore dollar debt, and then the more demand is for dollars, and it kind of entrenches itself. And it's a really kind of hard ship to turn. And we're starting to, it's become such a problem that we're starting to see kind of signs that many countries are kind of starting to kind of emphasize that more and more. So it starts, of course, with the countries that are more adversarial to the U.S. So we've seen Russia de-dollarize. They've pressed to do more of their trade in euros and other currencies. We've seen, for example, 2 years ago, the trade between Russia and China was almost entirely dollar based, and now it's less than half dollar based. And euros actually just overtook dollars for the trade that happens between those countries. And now we're seeing kind of drama around the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. right? So there's all sort of those geopolitical kind of chessboard stuff that different countries are kind of aiming for, and whether or not the U.S. goes along with it or kind of sanctions things like that. It's kind of like the last gasps of a system that's not really working anymore, and people have kind of different levels of understanding of who it benefits and whether or not they want to end the system and how they want to end it. So I think kind of a messy outcome is just a more kind of a multipolar system where you have kind of a little bit of a increase in diversification of the types of currencies that are used to buy oil essentially. But then kind of in that world you shift more towards neutral settlement, right? So we're seeing kind of central banks kind of gravitate a little bit towards gold here. We're seeing kind of because it's kind of a counterparty free, uh, you know, kind of, there's no counterparty risk there. They have kind of their own sort of partially inflation adjusted kind of assets sitting on their central bank balance sheet. But then, yeah, I think if you kind of do it better than that, you kind of if there's some sort of unification, some sort of agreement to kind of deal with the system, then I think you can get into to better constructed kind of systems where you have more of a neutral settlement, kind of layer. You don't have kind of so much reliance on one country's currency and all the sort of associated problems that come with that.